This video begins with graphic descriptions of what it is like to be wounded and die in modern warfare, particularly during World War I. It is not for the squeamish, but it is important, not least because those who call for war must know what they are calling for, because there are those who want to sell you ambiguous ideas of national interest at the price of a faraway, conveniently out-of-sight pile of gore. And anyone who cannot stomach this catalog of gore has no business supporting any war in any capacity. War is a course which should be decided upon only on the condition that you are willing to undergo these horrors yourself. I hope that you will listen on, meditate on these horrors, so that, as a wise man once said, you can count the cost before going to war. If nothing else, you will have the truth about what war is and the way it has been. They wrote in the old days that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. But in modern war, there is nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog for no good reason. Hit in the head, you will die quickly and cleanly, even sweetly and fittingly, except for the white blinding flash that never stops. Unless perhaps it is only the frontal bone or your optic nerve that is smashed, or your jaw carried away, or your nose and cheekbones gone, so you can still think, but you have no face to talk with. But if you are not hit in the head, you will be hit in the chest, and choke in it, or in the lower belly, and feel it all slip and slide loosely as you open, to spill out when you try to get up. It's not supposed to be painful, but they always scream with it. It's the idea, I suppose. Or you may have the flash, the slamming clang of high explosive on a hard road, and find your legs are gone above the knee, or maybe just below the knee, or maybe just a foot gone, and you'll watch the white bone sticking out through your putty, or you'll watch them take a boot off with your foot a mush inside it, or feel an arm flop and learn how a bone feels grating. Or you will burn, choke, and vomit, or be blown to hell a dozen ways, without sweetness or fittingness. But none of this means anything. No catalog of horrors ever kept men from war. Before the war, you always think that it's not you that dies. But you will die, brother, if you go to it long enough. This channel is about men at war. It is about the worst that human beings have ever endured at each other's hands, and will continue to have to endure as long as humans interact. And because this channel is about the greatest difficulties men can face, it is therefore about heroism, genius, endurance, strength, and victory. It is about how the best that is in men comes out when they face the worst in war. It is about how men have been noble, how they have sacrificed themselves for good, and how they have won against staggering odds. And because this channel is about how war brings out the greatness in men, it is important to be clear on something that might not be stated in every video on this channel. War is not good. In fact, war is horrific. It is hell. And I want to be clear that we must do everything we can to avoid it and to keep from being involved in it, so long as we can continue to be true to our principles. I need to make this video because I owe it to everyone who has paid the ultimate price in war. Often their sacrifice is honorable, and it saves the lives and liberty of countless others. But often, men's lives have been unnecessarily wasted in war. And I owe this video to them and to everyone who might have to pay that unnecessary price because of the evil and stupidity of politicians. I owe this to everyone whose lives might be saved. If nothing else, I owe this video to Ernest Hemingway, since this channel is based heavily on his book, the book he edited, called Men at War. Not every man who has gone to war has seen war as evil, but many have, and Hemingway did. And while I don't necessarily agree with everything that Hemingway said about war, it's only right for me to include his views on the evils of war and his arguments against going to war. As a teenager in 1918, Hemingway had driven an ambulance in World War I and seen the unnecessary carnage of that war firsthand, and he had himself been wounded. 2 decades later, in the 1930s, as wars were once again raging all over the world in Asia and Europe, threatening to become a second world war, Hemingway wrote vehemently against getting involved in any of those foreign wars. He believed that America should not have gotten involved in World War II. He said that war is always a crime, and while he believed that once we are in a war, we must do everything in our power to win it, he also believed that before we are at war, we must do everything in our power to avoid it. The question is, how? Well, in 1935, Hemingway wrote that the only way to combat the murder that is war is to show the dirty combinations that make it, and the criminals and swine that hope for it, and the idiotic way they run it when they get it, so that an honest man will distrust it as he would a racket, and refuse to be enslaved into it. While a man is meant to fight and even to die for the good, too often war is not about the good. It is about profit, ambition, vainglory, and pettiness. This has to be exposed. While there's no shortage of examples of ambitious and greedy war profiteering from the last century, perhaps the greatest and most misunderstood war for profit is World War II. World War II is often thought of as an ideological war, a conflict which America and Europe was dragged into against their wills because of the aggressive imperialist ideologies of countries like Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. Indeed, this narrative was promulgated even during the war itself. When Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the US government quickly began producing a series of propaganda films called Why We Fight. These films claimed that Japan attacked America because the Japanese saw themselves as a divinely ordained master race, who, blindly devoted to the cult of the emperor, planned to conquer and rule the world, simply because they deserved to. This claim relied heavily on a document called the Tanaka Memorial.
Then Baron Gishi Tanaka, the Prime Minister, carefully set down Japanese aims in a document called the Tanaka Memorial. It was presented to the Emperor July 25, 1927. Here was their dream: Manchuria for raw materials, China for manpower, then a triumphant march through Indochina, Siam, Burma, India, the East Indies, and on through Australia and New Zealand. And in the north, all they claimed was that part of Russia east of Lake Baikal. That was to be the new order in Asia. Then the Japs would move eastward to crush the United States and really start their co-prosperity sphere.
The only problem with this is that the Tanaka Plan was likely a hoax. Despite presumably being an official document written by a Japanese prime minister and submitted to the emperor, no such document has ever been found in the original Japanese. No original or even a copy. Rather, it was the enemies of Japan, the Chinese, who claimed to have uncovered it in 1929. The earliest edition we have of it is in Chinese, not Japanese. And from the very beginning, the Japanese denied its authenticity. The reality is that there is no evidence to suggest that it was a real Japanese plan. Rather, it seems likely to have been a hoax created by the Chinese, or perhaps even by the Russians, since its authenticity was argued for by no less than Leon Trotsky. As further evidence of Japan's global ambitions, these American propaganda films claimed to quote the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy himself, Isoroku Yamamoto, who seemed very eager to conquer the mainland United States.
When war comes between Japan and the United States, I shall not be content merely to occupy Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, and San Francisco. I look forward to dictating the peace to the United States in the White House at Washington. Yamamoto wrote those words on January of 1941. Yes, the conquering Jap army down Pennsylvania Avenue. That was the final goal. You will see what they did to the men and women of Nanking, Hong Kong, and Manila. Imagine the field day they'd enjoy if they'd marched through the streets of Washington.
The only problem with this is that this letter was being directly mistranslated to make Yamamoto say something that he wasn't really saying. An accurate translation of the letter has a drastically different meaning. Just listen to what Yamamoto actually wrote. Quote, "Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. I wonder if our politicians, who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war, have confidence as to the outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices." Far from claiming that he wanted to conquer the mainland United States, Yamamoto was issuing a prescient warning that any war with the US, even a simple attack on US territory in the Pacific, would only end if the Japanese subjugated all of America, and he questioned whether the Japanese could actually win such a war. While many in the Japanese leadership were hoping that a decisive attack on Pearl Harbor would cause the US to withdraw from the Pacific, Yamamoto understood that this was not the case, and he therefore cautioned against any war with America. Thus, this letter doesn't just simply prove that Yamamoto, for one, was not eager for war with the US, but it also suggests that even the Japanese leaders who spoke quote-unquote lightly about a war with America had no desire, expectation, or intention of conquering the mainland United States. In fact, as we will see, it seems their motives were quite different. But what I find really fascinating is that even as early as 1935, 6 years before the Pearl Harbor attack, and 4 years before Hitler invaded Poland, Ernest Hemingway was appraising the world's geopolitical situation quite differently. Different even than the narrative that is still commonly accepted today. Even in 1935, war seemed like a good possibility, and Hemingway argued that if there was a war in Europe, the United States would inevitably, eventually, be dragged into it. Not necessarily by aggressive enemies, but by American political leaders. Writing in an article for Esquire magazine, he asserted, "If there is a general European war, we will be brought in if propaganda, think of how the radio will be used for this, greed, and the desire to increase the impaired health of the state can swing us in. Every move that is made now to deprive the people of their decision on all matters through their elected representatives and to delegate those powers to the executive bring us that much nearer war." The vast majority of Americans did not want to have anything to do with the war. Most Americans were against getting involved. But Hemingway predicted that American leaders would use propaganda to sway the American public into supporting the war, and that war powers would eventually be delegated to the president. Furthermore, he argued that the reasons for getting involved in a foreign war would not be to fight for some moral cause or for national security, but rather the reasons would be economic. Specifically, Hemingway cites greed and a desire to bolster the impaired health of the state as the main causes. In order to understand this, we have to remember that in 1935, America was still in the midst of the Great Depression, a disaster that was both economic and social. While the causes of the Great Depression are no doubt complicated and still hotly debated, Hemingway pointed a finger at government mismanagement, especially as the Depression wore on in the 1930s. Between the presidencies of Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt, there was little economic improvement as the 30s wore on. Despite Roosevelt's famous New Deal launching in 1933, Roosevelt's policies were never enough to bring the American economy completely out of recession. But Hemingway knew that when all of Roosevelt's other policies failed, there was one thing that likely could bring America out of depression: war. Hemingway argued that when a country and its economy are struggling because of mismanagement and bad policies, war is a quick solution for those problems of incompetence, which makes war an appealing option for politicians who are otherwise failing to accomplish what they and their constituents want. Hemingway writes, "The first panacea for a mismanaged nation is inflation of the currency. The second is war." A panacea is basically a solution or remedy for a difficult disease. So Hemingway is saying that inflating the currency and going to war will solve a lot of problems when a country or economy is in trouble. But the problem is that these solutions are only temporary. As Hemingway goes on to say, both bring a temporary prosperity, both bring a permanent ruin. But both are the refuge of political and economic opportunists.
What inflation has done before, it will do again. Everything's looking up. Throw out the chest. Get into step. Snap into it. What a man and what a leader. Yowzer. Happy days are here again.
Inflation might cripple entire economies, but never mind that. Never mind that the value of the dollar only continues to decrease. Never mind that war brings ruin to countries and destroys men and their families. With a sprinkle of magic journalism, approval ratings will still go up even during a disastrous war, and a handful of powerful opportunists will reap massive profits. No doubt a foreign war can absolutely revitalize a country and get it back on its feet, especially if it's done shrewdly. Indeed, it seems that this is basically what happened in America during World War II. Many economists believe that government spending on the war caused, or at least accelerated, recovery from the Great Depression, though other economists will argue that it did not play that large a role in the recovery, even if it did help in reducing unemployment. Still, it's been said that massive war spending in the US doubled economic growth rates, either masking the effects of the Depression or essentially ending it. Either way, businessmen ignored the mounting national debt and heavy new taxes and redoubled their efforts for greater output to take advantage of generous government contracts. War is a highly profitable business. Given the way that things turned out, it's not entirely surprising that some have theorized that Franklin Roosevelt wanted to get involved in a war in Europe in order to, if nothing else, get America out of economic depression. While these theories tend to rely on dubious evidence, it's worth pointing out that these ideas are nothing new. In fact, even before America's entrance into the war, Hemingway was already suspicious of FDR. Even in 1935, 4 years before Hitler invaded Poland in 1938, Hemingway was connecting dots that made him believe that Roosevelt was eager to get into a foreign war, saying that the fate of our country for the next 100 years or so depends on the extent of Franklin D. Roosevelt's ambition. If he is ambitious only to serve his country, as Cleveland was, we and our children and their children will be very fortunate. If he is ambitious personally, to leave a great name, or to eclipse the luster of the name he bears, which was made famous by another man, we will be out of luck, because the sensational improvements that can be made legally in the country in time of peace are being rapidly exhausted. It was in 1935 that Roosevelt persuaded Congress to revise the Neutrality Act, allowing the U.S. to sell arms to Britain and France. But even beyond this, it was the president's war hawk rhetoric that led Hemingway to write a second article for Esquire, published that same year, in which he gave his reason for writing, saying that, having read the president's reported statements to a group of representatives, that he could, if he would, put the U.S. into war in 10 days, this one is still about the next war. In other words, Roosevelt's own statements that he had organized the military in such a way that he could put the U.S. into a war in the span of 10 days, this made Hemingway feel that it was necessary to write another article against going to war. And this article would take aim at the president himself. Hemingway suspected that Roosevelt was personally ambitious, and that he wanted to leave behind a great name, and even to eclipse the reputation of his relative, Theodore Roosevelt. Hemingway argued that any opportunity for earning a great legacy in America during a time of peace was being rapidly exhausted. However, a war in Europe, on the other hand, offered an enticing opportunity to make a name and, I don't know, get your profile on the face of the dime. Hemingway wrote somewhat sarcastically that in the next 10 years, there will be much fighting. There will be opportunities for the United States to again swing the balance of power in Europe. She will again have a chance to save civilization. She will have a chance to fight another war to end war. Thus, whoever leads the nation will have a chance to be the greatest man in the world for a short time, and the nation can hold the sack once the excitement is over. This would make war a great temptation indeed, especially for a man in the White House, who could gain a reputation for being a great man, leading a nation to victory in a troubled time, and he wouldn't even have to fight in that war or be killed or miss his afternoon tea. If Hemingway sounds tactfully ambiguous in his Esquire articles, he was more direct in his introduction to Men at War, written after America's entrance into the fray. He still avoided naming names, but he does still blame our entrance into the war on the quote-unquote politicians of this country. The editor of this anthology, who took part and was wounded in the last war to end war, hates war and hates all the politicians whose mismanagement, gullibility, cupidity, selfishness, and ambition brought on this present war and made it inevitable. In other words, Hemingway was going so far as to claim, without elaborating, that American leaders had directly caused World War II, or at least America's involvement in it. They organized things in such a way as to make that war inevitable. An accusation which may be referring to Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy concerning the Japanese in the Pacific. You see, during the Great Depression, Japan was facing economic trouble just like the rest of the world. And in 1931, in order to try and solve their economic problems, Japan invaded and occupied Manchuria, a territory that was fertile and rich in resources, a move which further confirms Hemingway's claim that war is a quick solution to economic problems. Over the years, Japan would continue to expand into China, committing horrific atrocities in the wake of its military expansion, perhaps most infamously in the horrific rape of Nanking, during which the Japanese butchered an estimated 150,000 male quote-unquote war prisoners and massacred an additional 50,000 male civilians, as well as raping at least 20,000 women and girls of all ages, many of whom were mutilated or killed in the process. Obviously, it's only understandable that the United States would oppose a country whose persistent expansionism placed no reins on these kinds of unspeakable crimes. However, the USA would go far beyond verbal criticism of Japan. The Roosevelt administration would take active measures to try and stop Japanese expansion in ways that would involve the US in Asian affairs. For example, by supporting China and implementing harsh economic sanctions on the Japanese. In 1941, as the Japanese prepared to invade British Malaysia in pursuit of resources like rice, rubber, and tin, as well as to invade the Dutch East Indies in order to obtain oil, the Roosevelt administration retaliated by seizing all Japanese assets in the United States, and American allies like Great Britain followed suit. The result was that Japan lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and 88% of its imported oil. And this would be a major problem for Japan because Japan only had enough oil in its reserves to last 3 years. Thus, with these actions, the Roosevelt administration was basically forcing Japan to make one of two choices: Either Japan could withdraw from Southeast Asia and China completely and hope that the embargoes would be lifted, a path which would not only end their imperial ambitions but would possibly bring economic hardship to their homeland and basically make them subservient to the United States, since they would be forced to rely on an American-led trade coalition for the resources they needed. Alternatively, the Japanese could choose another path, moving to maintain their sovereignty and continue to pursue the natural resources they needed elsewhere in the Pacific, likely to be found in European colonies. It was the choice between life and death, national autonomy versus slavery, and the Japanese predictably chose to continue expanding into European colonial territories in order to, in their words, preserve the life of their empire. But this path would still put Japan in a precarious position. A few days after the Allied embargo, the Japanese Foreign Ministry sent a dispatch to Washington, dated 31st July 1941, which gave the Japanese perspective. Commercial and economic relations between Japan and third countries, led by England and the United States, are gradually becoming so horribly strained that we cannot endure it much longer. Consequently, our empire, to save its very life, must take measures to secure the raw materials of the South Seas. Our empire must immediately take steps to break asunder this ever-strengthening chain of encirclement, which is being woven under the guidance and with the participation of England and the United States, acting like a cunning dragon, seemingly asleep. This is why we decided to obtain military bases in French Indochina and to have our troops occupy that territory. While America had not yet been openly aggressive to Japan, militarily, yet still from the Japanese perspective, the Western forces were tightening a chain around the Japanese Empire. The US already had a military base in the Philippines, and when Roosevelt moved the American naval fleet from the coast of California to Hawaii, it was seen as the aggressive and disingenuous move of a dragon who was pretending to be asleep but tightening its coils around a prey it intended to strangle. For the Japanese, it was a clear message that if they invaded British Malaysia, America would attack Japan in retaliation. And since the Japanese deemed it necessary to invade British colonial territory for resources, an act which would guarantee an attack from the US, it seemed strategic to try and cripple the US fleet before it could intervene. And so the Japanese hatched the plan to attack the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Thus, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was not an unprovoked attack on a peaceful country that was minding its own business. The truth is more complicated than that. As far as I can see, the Japanese never planned to conquer the mainland United States. They never wanted to. Rather, Japan attacked America because it needed resources in the Pacific, and it was forced into a corner, if not outright provoked, by the Roosevelt administration, which sought to deny Japan those resources. A fact that is becoming more and more widely known. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that Japan was justified in its expansionist policies or in attacking Pearl Harbor. I don't think it was. There's a lot to criticize when it comes to Japanese imperial expansion. And furthermore, I do think that the Roosevelt administration was justified in its harsh economic sanctions. It makes sense, at least in principle, if not always in practice, to cut economic ties with a country that is committing atrocities. After all, we don't want to actively enfranchise such evil by supplying the very necessities like oil that makes such evil actionable. What's less defensible is the move of the United States Navy to Hawaii, a move which was opposed by the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, James O. Richardson, who protested so vehemently against the Navy being moved to Hawaii that he was fired from his command. It's just not as easy to defend Roosevelt's commitment to defend the colonial territories of the British and the Dutch. Why should America be willing to go to war to defend colonial territories in order to stop a country like Japan from doing the very thing that countries like Britain and Holland had already been doing for much longer. The simple answer, of course, is that we were on the British team, and Japan was on a different team. This may sound trite, and that's not to say that international alliances are an uncomplicated thing. The reality is that they are very complicated, especially in times of conflict. The reality of leadership consists of very often choosing between the lesser of many evil choices and choosing which sacrifices you must be forced to make. So I don't at all want to suggest that the events leading up to World War II were simple, or that there were any simple answers to be had. Whether or not America should have been involved in World War II is a complicated question. The reason I'm walking us through these historical events is to try and prove, if nothing else, that American involvement in World War II could have been avoided. If America's political leaders had truly wanted to stay out of the war, they could have. If the United States was not so tenacious in its involvement in the South Pacific, America would never have been attacked and may never have gone to war. The Roosevelt administration could have sanctioned Japan without aggressively tightening its noose around it. Countless lives would have been saved, and history would probably look very different. Not only can we learn something about the repercussions of foreign policy, but this case study also draws back the curtain and shows us the nature of the political power possessed by the American executive branch, even before World War II. Back in his 1935 article, Hemingway had warned that war is made or planned now by individual men, demagogues and dictators who play on the patriotism of their people to mislead them into a belief in the great fallacy of war, when all their vaunted reforms have failed to satisfy the people they misrule. And we in America should see that no man is ever given, no matter how gradually or how noble and excellent the man, the power to put this country into a war which is now being prepared and brought closer each day with all the premeditation of a long-planned murder. For when you give power to an executive, you do not know who will be filling the position when the time of crisis comes. It was because our forefathers in America knew how power affected men that they had limited the term of the executive. Of course, Hemingway could not yet have known that FDR would spit on that American tradition and become the only president to serve more than 2 terms in office. But Hemingway's Principles of Human Nature did predict this outcome, an outcome of something he called the malady of power. Basically, when men attain positions of power, they begin to think that they are indispensable. You begin to think that you have to stay in power because nothing will be done rightly unless you stay in power. The moment you leave, things will inevitably begin to go wrong. And this seems to be exactly correct. FDR ran for a 3rd term and won in 1940, arguing that it was necessary for national stability in the midst of a depression and looming war.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
And he even ran for a 4th term in 1944, even after being diagnosed with hypertension and acute congestive heart failure, leaving him able to work no more than 4 days out of a week, and eventually leading to his death a mere 82 days into his 4th term. Hemingway was able to predict this course of action because he espoused true principles regarding the nature of power and corruption. In the end, we may never know if FDR really wanted a war in Europe and the Pacific, but it doesn't matter. We know that his actions did lead to it, and we know the principles of power and how power affects men. We know that the actions of the powerful, whether from folly or corruption, shake entire nations and affect the lives of ordinary people, sometimes cutting them short. And Hemingway's principle-based warning against the malady of power means that it applies as forcefully today as it did even in the different circumstances of World War II. The same hazards and motivations will still accompany our politicians today. For this reason, Hemingway urged not only that we must make sure that no man has the power to put us into war, but also that we need to choose our leaders carefully. He wrote, "For the next 10 years, we need a man without ambition, a man who hates war and knows that no good ever comes of it, and a man who proves his beliefs by adhering to them. All candidates will need to be measured against these requirements. Furthermore, no man nor group of men incapable of fighting or exempt from fighting should in any way be given the power, no matter how gradually it is given them, to put this country or any country into war." Unfortunately, the sad reality is that our leaders already have this power. They can send men and women to fight and die in a war that they will never have to risk their necks in. But even if an elected official can order men into war in an instant, a war is only likely to be effective if men comply. For that reason, Hemingway warned in his day about the use of propaganda and how propaganda could be used to sway the American people into supporting war. Hemingway said that if we want to stay out, now is the time to decide to stay out. Now, before the propaganda starts. Now is the time to make it impossible for any one man or any 100 men or any 1,000 men to put us in a war in 10 days. In a war they will not have to fight. Hemingway knew all too well what he was up against, the powerful machine of what we today call the media.
If another war develops in Europe, should America take part again? No. 95%. We the people had spoken. 19 out of 20 of us said, include us out.
Hemingway knew that anyone who was a journalist, advertiser, or news anchor today could tomorrow become a blatant propagandist. Again, he writes, "A country never wants war until a man, through the power of propaganda, convinces it. Propaganda is stronger now than it has ever been before. Its agencies have been mechanized, multiplied, and controlled until, in a state ruled by one man, truth can never be presented. Propaganda sways us, often through a false sense of idealism, a fact of which we should take careful note, since idealism and indeed ideology are incredibly powerful motives for war. It's natural to feel pity for oppressed people, and an administration which is bent on ambition or profit will stir up pity or anger or moral indignation until good people are willing to send their sons to die, even in the cause of a foreign country. Hemingway rejects this smoke and mirrors idealism, responding in a way that may strike many as harsh. He wrote, "No European country is our friend, nor has been since the last war, and no country but one's own is worth fighting for. Never again should this country be put into a European war through mistaken idealism, through propaganda, through the desire to back our creditors, or through the wish of anyone, through war, notoriously the health of the state, to make a going concern out of a mismanaged one. Of the hell broth that is brewing in Europe, we have no need to drink. Europe has always fought. The intervals of peace are only armistices. We were fools to be sucked in once on a European war, and we should never be sucked in again." Nowadays, we are so accustomed to the kumbaya message of globalism, or the utilitarian strategies for world peace that came out of the alliances forged in the Second World War, that it is startling to hear someone say, "No European country is our friend."
We simply did not want to understand that our individual and national problems were, and always will be, dependent upon the problems of the whole world.
But when it really comes down to the question of actually going and fighting for another country that is not your own, you are faced with a couple of questions. First, are you willing to go fight and kill and die for another country. Maybe you are willing to fight, but do you really know the horrors you are signing up for? Hemingway tried to dispel the romanticism of any foreign war with the catalog of horrors that opened this video. Nevertheless, there may be men who are willing to face those horrors for a good cause. And Hemingway responded that if that's the case, then all right, they should go and fight. If war was fought by those who wanted to fight it and knew what they were doing and liked it or even understood it, then it would be defensible. But those who want to go to war, the elite, are killed off in the first months, and the rest of the war is fought by men who are enslaved into the bearing of arms. This is a valuable caveat. Hemingway was writing in the age of the military draft, and for him it was simply indefensible, criminal even, to draft men against their wills into fighting and dying in a foreign war that may or may not have been strictly necessary. Even when you are fighting for a good cause, it is wrong to force someone else to go with you and fight, suffer, and die for the good against their will. Let people who enjoy fighting, fight. Let men who know what they are doing sacrifice themselves. Nowadays, thankfully, it seems unlikely that the US would use the military draft to force men or women into combat in a foreign war. The development of the military-industrial complex, for better and for worse, has, in time since, enabled the creation of a powerful standing military without the need for conscription. But then again, we've not yet faced a true and global conflict of superpowers since World War II. Given a severe enough conflict and propaganda that is compelling enough, the draft could return. But even if not, and supposing a foreign war was fought by a purely voluntary fighting force, that voluntary fighting force still relies on its homeland for a chain of support. And this invites a whole host of moral conundrums that are beyond the scope of this video. I won't pretend to have all the answers. In my own opinion, there is a time for war, just as there is a time for peace. And perhaps there are morally justifiable reasons for invading a foreign country or helping to defend it, just as there are moral reasons to defend your neighbor's house or intervene in his house if you see him abusing his kids through the window. Though it might be equally wrong for you to intervene in those situations if your own house is not set in order. Every man has to decide these questions for himself. After America's entry into World War II, Hemingway seemed to resign himself to the idea that foreign wars are now simply an inevitable feature of the new globalism, saying that either we will go to war or war will come to us. All of history is of one piece, and it is ourselves who bore the least weight of casualties in 1917 and 1918 who have to bear the most to defeat Germany this time. Once a nation has entered into a policy of foreign wars, there is no withdrawing. If you do not go to them, then they will come to you. It was April 1917 that ended our isolation. It was not Pearl Harbor. But there will be no lasting peace, nor any possibility of a just peace, until all lands where the people are ruled, exploited, and governed by any government whatsoever against their consent are given their freedom. This premise has implications which have no place in this introduction. Hemingway was not a pacifist. While he argued against all wars that were in any way avoidable, he also stated, "I have seen much war in my lifetime, and I hate it profoundly. But there are worse things than war, and all of them come with defeat. The more you hate war, the more you know that once you are forced into it, for whatever reason it may be, you have to win it. You have to win it and get rid of the people who made it, and see that, this time, it never comes to us again. We will also fight this war to enjoy the rights and privileges conveyed to us by the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. And woe to anyone who has any plans for taking those rights and privileges away from us under any guise or for any reason whatsoever. And one wonders whether Hemingway was more worried about an American administration taking away those rights than a foreign power. In any case, even if this does sound like melodramatic political chest thumping, Hemingway, to his credit, was willing to put his skin in the game and actually go to war. In a private 1942 letter, he wrote, "I have decided, or rather I decided several months before it started, or maybe several years, say, not to write propaganda in this war at all. I am willing to go to it, and will send my kids to it and will give what money I have to it, but I want to write just what I believe all the way through it and after it." And that's exactly what Hemingway did. He did go to war, and he did write what he wanted to about it. As a journalist, he landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day with the 7th Wave, and though he was not permitted to leave the landing craft, he chronicled the experience in a piece called Voyage to Victory. Afterward, he followed the U.S. Army from the liberation of Paris to the Battle of the Bulge, eventually being awarded the Bronze Star for unorthodox contributions to the war effort. So even for Hemingway himself, there was no easy one-size-fits-all approach to foreign engagement. But we can still draw distinctions. There are reasons for war, but the mismanagement of a nation is not one of them. Nor is personal ambition, and we would be wise to mistrust politicians. Personally, I'm glad the Allies won the Second World War, because the world seems to be a better place as a result. At the same time, I have a hard time justifying the policies that made America's entrance into the war inevitable. It's one thing for a man to be drafted to protect his home soil. It's another thing for him to be drafted to defend national interest abroad. Something which hopefully we will not have to worry about ever again. If nothing else, I hope this video illustrates how complicated the beginning of any war is. I hope it has given you a mistrust for politicians and for media. I hope you've gained valuable knowledge and maybe even found words to articulate something you've long felt, but maybe did not know how to say. Words which we should be speaking while we have time. The pen is still mightier than the sword, and the tongue can still set the world on fire. With patience, a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue will break a bone. It behooves us to master it, because wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good.